Most people don't realize this, but the hardest battles we fight are not the ones in our relationships. They're the ones in our own minds. It's the voice that tells you you're not enough, the memory that replays every mistake you've ever made, the quiet doubts that sit with you even in the happiest moments. And what happens is this: when those thoughts run unchecked, they start shaping how you show up for yourself and for the people you love. You pull back when you should lean in. You get defensive when you really just want to be understood. You settle when deep down you know you were meant for more. That's the real prison. Not what anyone else says or does, but what you've been repeating to yourself for so long that you've started to believe it. And if you've ever wondered why you feel stuck, unseen, or disconnected, it's not because you're broken. It's because the story running in your head has been louder than the truth sitting in your heart. There's a weight that comes with living every day in your own head. The kind of weight nobody else can see, but you carry it everywhere. It shows up in the way you second guess yourself before you speak, in the way you replay a conversation long after it's over, in the way you feel smaller than you are when someone questions you. And it's confusing because on the outside, you might look steady. You might even be the one people come to for advice, but inside there's this quiet storm of thoughts that chip away at your confidence. That's the part no one talks about, how exhausting it is to live in a cycle of your own doubts. And what I want you to hear right now is this: you are not crazy for feeling stuck. You are not weak for having negative thoughts, and you are not alone in this. What we're going to do here is not about pretending everything is fine. It's about learning how to reset the story you tell yourself so you can finally step into the life you've been reaching for without the weight of those old voices holding you back. Most of us don't realize how much of our life is shaped not by what happens to us, but by the story we've been telling ourselves about what those moments mean. And sometimes that story isn't even ours. It's something we picked up years ago, from a parent's harsh words, from being overlooked by someone we loved, from a mistake we made that we never really forgave ourselves for. That story starts small, but it repeats. And the more it repeats, the more convincing it becomes. Before long, you're not just hearing it, you're living like it's true. Think about it. If you've been carrying a story that says, "I'm hard to love," you'll find yourself bracing for rejection before it even happens. You'll second guess the good in your relationships because deep down you're waiting for someone to confirm what you've been telling yourself all along. If your story says, "I'm not enough," you'll work yourself to exhaustion trying to earn worth that was never missing in the first place. And if your story says, "I always mess things up," you'll hold yourself back, not because you can't do it, but because you've already decided the ending before you even begin. The truth is, those stories don't just stay in your head, they leak into your relationships. They change the way you listen, the way you speak, the way you trust. You might pull away from your partner because the story tells you they'll leave anyway. You might over-explain yourself in conversations because the story convinces you no one will really understand. Or you might stay quiet when you're hurt because you believe your needs don't matter as much as everyone else's. And none of that comes from what's happening in the moment. It comes from the story you've been carrying for years. Here's the shift I want you to see: you are not bound to that old script. Just because it's familiar doesn't mean it's true. Just because it's loud doesn't mean it deserves the final word. Rewriting the story you keep telling yourself doesn't mean ignoring the pain or pretending the past never happened. It means choosing not to let that pain define every chapter going forward. It means slowing down long enough to hear the difference between your fear and your reality. It means practicing the belief that you are worthy of love, respect, and peace, even on the days when your mind tries to convince you otherwise. That's the hard work, but it's also the freeing work. Because when you start to rewrite that story, the way you show up shifts. Instead of bracing for rejection, you open yourself to connection. Instead of drowning in self-doubt, you let yourself try again. Instead of hiding your needs, you learn to voice them calmly and clearly. And that's when relationships get healthier. Not because the other person suddenly changes, but because you finally stop treating an old wound as if it were still happening right now. You can't always control what life has written on your heart, but you can decide how the rest of the pages read. And sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do is lay down the story you've been repeating and pick up the one that tells the truth about who you are. Self-doubt is one of those things that doesn't always scream, it whispers. And yet somehow it ends up being the loudest voice in the room. You know that feeling when you walk into a conversation and you already assume you're going to say the wrong thing? Or when someone gives you feedback and instead of hearing their words, All you hear is confirmation of what you've been secretly fearing about yourself. That's self-doubt at work. It doesn't wait for evidence. It builds its own case against you before you even get the chance to speak. What makes it so heavy is how it creeps into your relationships. If you're always questioning yourself, then you're probably questioning them too. You might wonder if they really love you, if they actually mean what they say, if they'll stay when things get hard. And the irony is, the more you doubt yourself, the more you start doubting the people who care about you. Not because they've proven untrustworthy, but because your mind keeps telling you they couldn't possibly see you as worthy. That's the kind of quiet erosion self-doubt creates. It doesn't blow things up all at once. It wears them down little by little. Think about how you respond when self-doubt gets loud. Maybe you over-explain yourself because you want to make sure no one can misunderstand you. Maybe you hold back from sharing your feelings because you assume they're too much. Maybe you keep apologizing for things that don't even need an apology because you're convinced you're somehow in the wrong. And over time, those patterns create distance. The people around you may not even know why, but they can feel it, the hesitation, the guardedness, the constant second guessing that keeps you from showing up as your full self. Here's what I need you to hear. Self-doubt doesn't make you broken. It makes you human. Everyone wrestles with it in some form. The difference is whether you let that voice run the room or whether you start learning how to put it back in its place. And putting it back in its place doesn't mean pretending it's not there. It means noticing it when it shows up and reminding yourself it doesn't hold the final truth. It means separating your worth from your mistakes, your value from your fears, your identity from the harshest story your mind wants to tell. When you start to quiet that voice, even just a little, relationships begin to breathe again. You stop needing constant reassurance because you start to believe the reassurance you already have. You stop holding back your needs because you know they're not a burden. You stop walking into every moment with the assumption that you're one step away from failing, and instead you give yourself permission to just be present. And that presence, calm, steady, grounded, that's what strengthens connection more than any perfect words ever could. Self-doubt may have been the loudest voice in the room for a long time, but it doesn't have to stay that way. You can learn to hear it without obeying it. You can learn to recognize it without surrendering to it. And in doing so, you give yourself and your relationships the space to grow into something healthier, stronger, and far more honest than the fear-driven story you've been living under. Silent resentment is one of those things that doesn't show up all at once. It builds slowly, almost quietly, until one day you realize you're carrying more distance in your relationship than closeness. It usually starts with something small. A comment that stung but you let slide, a promise that wasn't kept, a need you swallowed instead of voicing. And because you didn't want to start a fight, because you wanted to keep the peace, you kept it inside. But here's the thing about unspoken hurt, it doesn't just disappear. It lingers, it hardens, and it begins to shape how you see the person standing in front of you. The cost of carrying that resentment is heavier than most people admit. You might still go through the motions, sharing meals, having conversations, showing up to family events, but underneath there's this low burn of bitterness that never really goes away, and it changes the way you connect. Maybe you stop being fully honest, because what's the point if you feel like they won't hear you? Maybe you stop reaching out for affection, because deep down you're keeping score. Or maybe you start pulling back in subtle ways, giving less of yourself, while convincing yourself it's fine. But inside, you feel the gap widening, and it hurts. Resentment is dangerous because it convinces you to rewrite the story of your relationship through the lens of disappointment. Suddenly, every small mistake feels bigger. Every short word feels sharper. Every flaw feels unforgivable, and you stop seeing the whole person, their effort, their love, their humanity, and instead you only see the places they let you down. That filter doesn't just keep you from loving them fully, it keeps you from being at peace with yourself. But let's be honest, the silence is often about fear. Fear that if you say what you really feel, it'll spark conflict you can't control. Fear that they'll dismiss it, or worse, dismiss you. Fear that your needs will sound unreasonable, or that asking for more will make you seem ungrateful. So you trade honesty for quiet and connection for distance, thinking it will cost less. But over time, the silence costs more. It costs trust. It costs intimacy. It costs the chance to work through the real issue before it becomes the whole foundation of the relationship. Here's what I want you to see. Resentment doesn't mean you're unloving. It means you're hurting. And the only way through hurt is truth. Truth spoken calmly. Truth spoken with care. Truth that comes from wanting to repair, not wanting to attack. That's the bridge out of resentment. giving your pain a voice without letting it become a weapon. Because when resentment goes unspoken, it builds walls. But when it's faced with honesty, it can actually build deeper understanding. You give the other person the chance to meet you where you are, and you give yourself the relief of no longer carrying it alone. The cost of silent resentment is high, but the reward of courageous honesty is higher. And that's where real connection has a chance to breathe again. Overthinking has a way of convincing you that you're just being careful, that you're being thoughtful, that you're trying to make sure you don't get it wrong. But what it really does is keep you locked in a loop where no answer ever feels good enough. You replay conversations over and over, analyzing every word you said, every expression they gave back. You sit awake at night, building entire scenarios in your head about what might happen, what they might be feeling, or what you should have done differently. And the irony is, the more you try to find certainty by thinking it through, the less certain you actually feel. In relationships, this trap takes a heavy toll, because when you're stuck in your head, you're not present with the person in front of you. Instead of hearing their words, you're filtering them through a dozen different worries. Instead of enjoying the moment, you're dissecting it. And over time, that creates distance. The other person might feel like you're distracted, like you're holding back, like you're not fully there with them. But the truth is, you're not with them because you're busy fighting a storm in your own mind. Overthinking also has a way of making problems bigger than they are. A simple delay in a text reply suddenly feels like rejection. A change in tone becomes a sign of something deeper. A small misunderstanding turns into proof that everything is falling apart. And once your mind starts spiraling, you can convince yourself of almost anything, not because it's true, but because it feels real in the moment. That's how overthinking quietly sabotages connection. It replaces reality with assumptions and then asks you to live by them. At its core, overthinking is about fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of being hurt, fear of not being enough. And so you try to think your way into safety. But safety doesn't come from endless analyzing. It comes from learning to trust yourself, to trust the other person, and to trust that not every unknown is a threat. That's where freedom begins, not in solving every scenario in your head, but in recognizing that the stories you create are not the same as the truth in front of you. Breaking free from overthinking doesn't mean shutting off your mind or pretending you don't care. It means learning to pause, to notice when your thoughts are running miles ahead of reality and gently bringing yourself back. It means choosing to ask instead of assume, to speak instead of spiral, to be honest about your fears instead of letting them run wild in silence. That kind of presence, calm, direct, open, creates space for relationships to actually grow, because you're no longer trapped in a world of what ifs. You're grounded in what is. And here's the beauty of it, Ty. When you let go of the trap of overthinking, you give yourself permission to breathe again. You discover that connection doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. You see that love isn't found in predicting every possible outcome, but in showing up as you are, here and now. And that shift, as simple as it sounds, is what brings the peace your mind has been chasing all along. Fear of failing has a way of stopping you before you even start. It convinces you that the risk isn't worth it, that the disappointment will be too heavy, that you'll embarrass yourself if it doesn't work out. And so you hesitate, you play it safe. You talk yourself out of opportunities that could have brought you joy, connection, or growth. What looks like procrastination on the surface is often just protection, protecting yourself from the sting of falling short. But the truth is, that kind of protection comes with its own pain, because when fear keeps you from trying, you never get to see what could have been. In relationships, this fear can be especially damaging. You might hold back from opening up because you're afraid of being misunderstood. You might avoid difficult conversations because you're worried you'll say the wrong thing and make things worse. You might not go after the kind of love or partnership you truly want because you're scared you won't measure up or that you'll only get rejected. And so instead of stepping into the relationship fully, you stay half present, close enough to feel something, but distant enough to not risk everything. The problem is connection doesn't thrive in halfway. It requires presence, and presence requires courage. Think about how many moments get lost this way. The "I love you" you didn't say because you weren't sure they'd say it back. The idea you didn't share because you feared it would sound foolish. The apology you held in because you weren't certain it would be received well. All of those moments add up, and they shape the relationship just as much as the words you do speak. Fear doesn't just silence you. It silently builds walls that keep you from the closeness you want. Here's the shift I want you to see. Failure isn't the enemy. Never trying is, because failure can teach, it can grow. It can stretch you into a stronger version of yourself. But never trying leaves you stuck in the same place, holding on to the same doubts, telling yourself the same old story about what you can and can't do. And in relationships, that means you keep living at a surface level, never fully experiencing the depth of trust and intimacy that comes from showing up even when it feels risky. Courage doesn't mean you won't feel afraid. It means you're willing to act even while the fear is still there. It means saying the thing that matters, even if your voice shakes. It means reaching for connection, even if rejection is possible. It means trying again, even after the last attempt didn't go the way you hoped. That's where growth lives. That's where love gets stronger, not in the absence of failure, but in the willingness to move through it together. When fear of failing keeps you from trying, you may avoid the sting of disappointment, but you also miss the beauty of possibility. And life, relationships, love, they're built on possibility. On choosing to step forward, not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because the risk of trying is always lighter than the regret of never having tried at all. Negative thoughts don't usually show up with flashing lights and loud alarms. They slip in quietly, almost unnoticed, and before you realize it, they've started coloring how you see everything in your relationship. It might be as small as thinking they don't really care. When your partner forgets something minor, or assuming they must be upset with me just because they're quieter than usual, those thoughts seem harmless in the moment, but repeated enough times, they start to shape your reality. You don't just think them, you begin to live as if they're true. And here's the tricky part. Once you buy into those negative thoughts, your behavior shifts. If you're convinced your partner isn't listening, you stop opening up as much. If you believe they'll never change, you quit giving them chances. If you assume they don't love you the way you need, you start building walls instead of bridges. None of that comes from the actual truth of the relationship. It comes from the filter those thoughts create. What began as a quiet assumption slowly becomes a self-fulfilling cycle. Think about how many conversations go sideways because of this. A simple disagreement about chores becomes evidence in your head that they don't respect you. A moment of distraction during dinner convinces you they're losing interest. A forgotten text reply turns into a whole story about being taken for granted. And then you start reacting, not to what's actually happening, but to the story your mind has been running on repeat. That's where connection gets sabotaged, not by the event itself, but by the meaning you've attached to it. The truth is, most partners aren't out to hurt each other. But when negative thoughts are left unchecked, you start relating to them through suspicion, doubt, and criticism. You may withdraw because you assume they won't meet you halfway, or you may get defensive because you've already decided they're against you. Over time, that creates a relationship where neither person feels fully seen or safe. And both of you end up carrying the weight of misunderstandings that were never even spoken out loud. Here's what's important to remember. Just because a thought feels true doesn't mean it is true. Feelings are real, but they aren't always accurate. A negative thought is often just fear, insecurity, or past hurt dressing itself up as certainty. And if you're not careful, it becomes the lens you use to interpret everything your partner says or does. That's why catching it matters. Not shaming yourself for having the thought, but pausing long enough to ask, is this the story I want to live by? Or is this just an old wound trying to write today's script? When you begin to recognize those negative thoughts for what they are, you create space to choose differently. You can ask instead of assume. You can share how you feel without attacking. You can give your partner the benefit of the doubt rather than handing them the verdict before they've even spoken. And what that does is restore connection, not because everything is perfect, but because you're no longer letting quiet suspicion run the relationship. Negative thoughts will always try to slip in. That's human. But they don't have to run the show. You have the power to notice them, challenge them, and replace them with something truer. And when you do, you'll find that the connection you've been craving wasn't gone. It was just buried under a story that was never yours to carry in the first place. Somewhere along the way, a lot of us stopped trusting our own voice. Maybe it was because every time you spoke up as a kid, you were told you were too sensitive. Maybe it was because in a past relationship, your feelings were dismissed or twisted until you doubted yourself. Or maybe it's been the slow drip of little comments and criticisms that left you wondering if what you think or feel really matters. Whatever the reason, you start to shrink back. You second guess what you want to say. You rehearse conversations in your head and then choose silence instead. And eventually, you begin to live more by the voices around you than by the one inside you. In relationships, that loss of trust in yourself shows up in ways you may not even notice. You go along with plans you don't enjoy because you don't want to cause conflict. You hold back how hurt you are because you're afraid it'll sound like complaining. You change the way you express yourself to fit what you think the other person wants, all the while feeling a little more invisible each time. And while you're trying to keep the peace, the cost is that you slowly lose connection with yourself. And without that connection, it's hard to truly connect with anyone else. The hard truth is that when you stop trusting your own voice, you start handing the pen of your life over to someone else. You let them write the story of who you are, how you feel, and what you need. But here's the reality: no one else can live that story for you. They don't know the full weight of your experiences, the depth of your heart, or the truth of what keeps you up at night. That's why your voice matters, not just for you, but for the health of every relationship you're in. Learning to trust your voice again doesn't mean being loud or forceful. It doesn't mean proving yourself in every conversation. It means relearning the quiet confidence that says, what I feel is valid, what I need is worth speaking, what I see is important. It means showing up to the table as a whole person, not just the agreeable version of yourself that feels safe to present. Because honesty, even if it's messy, builds far more trust than silence ever could. And I know the fear that comes with that, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of conflict, the fear that if you speak, you'll lose someone's love. But the truth is, if your voice can break a relationship, then silence was never going to save it. Real connection can only grow when both people bring their full selves to the table. And your full self includes your voice. When you start trusting your voice again, something shifts. You stop apologizing for existing. You stop needing constant permission to feel what you feel. You begin to stand a little taller, not because everything around you is perfect, but because you're no longer abandoning yourself. And that's where peace begins, not in being heard perfectly by everyone else, but in finally listening to yourself. Comparison is one of those habits that feels harmless in the moment, but carries a weight you don't always notice until it's pressing down on you. It starts small, scrolling through your phone and seeing someone else's highlight reel, or watching a friend's relationship look effortless while yours feels like work. And before you know it, you're measuring your life, your worth, your love against a standard that was never meant for you. What makes comparison so heavy is that it doesn't just stay in your head. It begins to shape the way you see yourself, and eventually the way you show up in your relationships. When you're constantly comparing yourself to others, it's hard to ever feel like enough. If someone else seems more attractive, you begin to wonder if your partner secretly wishes they were with someone different. If another couple looks happier, you start questioning whether your relationship is falling short. If a friend seems more confident, you second guess every word you say, thinking you must come across as less. And while none of these thoughts are based in truth, they can feel just as real. That's the hidden weight, living under the assumption that who you are, as you are, isn't measuring up. Over time, that mindset starts to erode connection. Instead of being present, you're distracted by what you think you lack. Instead of receiving love, you doubt it. Instead of appreciating the strengths you bring, you diminish them because they don't look like someone else's. Your partner may tell you they love you, but the comparison in your head whispers, not enough. They may show up for you in consistent, quiet ways, but you dismiss it because it doesn't look like the grand gestures you see somewhere else. And little by little, that robs both of you. Them of being fully trusted, and you of being fully at peace. The danger of comparison is that it always moves the finish line. No matter how much you grow, achieve, or love, there's always someone who seems to be doing it better. And if you're not careful, you'll end up chasing a life that isn't even yours, while neglecting the beauty of the one already in your hands. Relationships don't fall apart because you're not enough. They break down when you believe the lie that you aren't. Here's the truth: no one else can love the way you do. No one else carries your exact mix of patience, humor, kindness, or resilience. What makes connection meaningful isn't how it stacks up against anyone else's, but how honest and steady it feels between you and the person you're with. When you start to let go of comparison, you begin to see your relationship with clearer eyes, not as a competition, but as a partnership. And you start to see yourself with clearer eyes too. The freedom comes when you realize you were never meant to compete with anyone else's story. You were meant to live yours fully, to love in your own way, to bring your own voice, to show up as the version of you that doesn't need to measure against anyone, because the truth is, what you bring is already enough. And that's a weight you don't have to carry anymore. The lies in your head don't always sound like lies. They sound like caution. They sound like certainty. They sound like that familiar voice reminding you not to get your hopes up, not to trust too much, not to believe things are as good as they seem. And if you've lived with those thoughts long enough, they begin to feel like the truth. You start thinking, they don't really love me, or I'm always the problem, or this won't last, it never does. Those aren't facts. They're fears disguised as facts. And the more you give them power, the more they start running your relationships for you. Here's what that looks like in real life. Your partner comes home quiet, and instead of asking if they had a long day, your mind whispers, they're pulling away. A small disagreement happens, and instead of seeing it as a normal part of two people figuring things out, your mind says, this is proof we're not right for each other. They forget something small, and instead of letting it be human, your mind convinces you, I must not matter. Before you know it, you're not responding to the reality of your relationship anymore. You're responding to the lies in your head about it. The danger of those lies is that they keep you guarded. You don't open up because you've already convinced yourself you won't be understood. You don't give grace because you've already decided they don't deserve it. You don't allow yourself to enjoy what's good because you're bracing for it to disappear. And all of that happens without a word ever being spoken. That's how the lies win. They make you pull away without ever giving the relationship a chance to prove them wrong. Honesty is what breaks that cycle. And I don't just mean honesty with your partner, I mean honesty with yourself. The courage to admit, I'm scared right now. I'm assuming the worst. I'm reacting to an old wound, not this moment. That kind of honesty is hard, but it's freeing. Because once you can name it, you can separate it. You can see the difference between what's real and what's only a story your fear is telling you. And when you bring that honesty into the relationship, calmly, clearly, without blame, you open the door for connection instead of letting the lies slam it shut. Choosing honesty over the lies in your head doesn't guarantee everything will be easy, but it guarantees you'll be living in reality instead of a distorted version of it. It means giving your partner the chance to show up for you instead of punishing them for battles they never fought. It means trusting that your voice matters enough to be spoken and that the truth, even if it's messy, is always lighter to carry than the weight of constant suspicion. The lies in your head will always try to speak first, but you don't have to let them have the last word. When you choose honesty with yourself, with your partner, with your fears, you choose clarity over confusion, presence over assumptions, and love over the constant noise of doubt. And that choice can change everything.